we are delighted to all of those who have returned for day 2 of the Defending the Early Years 6th Annual Summer Institute. If you missed day 1, the recording will be available soon. We will record each day and send out the recordings to everyone who registered. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, my name is Denisha Jones, and I'm the Executive Director of Defending the Early Years. And the theme of this year's Summer Institute is Advancing Quality in Defense of Early Childhood Education and Care. And today our focus is on the work of ensuring high quality early childhood education and care for all through a focus on policy and practice. Before we get started with our amazing panelists, I want to review a few logistics with you. In addition to recording today's session, we are also streaming live to our Facebook page. If you would like a certificate of attendance, we will send out a form that you can complete in the email that you will receive tomorrow. Also this year, we're excited to offer our first Summer Institute Reflective Workbook. We know how important it is for early childhood practitioners and advocates to reflect on their work, and as we prepare to launch our Defending the Early Years Professional Learning Institute Reflective Practice Series, we wanted to begin by offering this free reflective workbook. In addition to the 6-hour certificate of attendance, if you fill out your workbook and send it to us, you can earn an additional 3 hours from our Professional Learning Institute. At the end, there will be time for Q&A. Please put questions that you have for the panelists in the Q&A. You can use the chat to say hello, introduce yourself, tell us your name, where you're from, your pronouns, and please feel free to have a conversation with other guests as well. We will be dropping links. Our project intern, Zoe Kim, will be dropping links in there, and we'll be sharing information with you. And then we collect all of the resources shared in the chat, and we send those to the email as well, and we'll post those on our website as well, too. But please put your questions for any panelist or myself as the co-moderator or the moderator into the Q&A, and we will use those towards the end. We will definitely go through, and if we don't get to your question, a panelist might be able to answer it if they see it in the Q&A, but it is very difficult to hunt through the chat for questions. So we'll be using that as well. We're also collecting, as I said, all the resources that are shared. If you have a link, if you hear of a study, something that you want to share, drop the link in the chat. Again, we'll collect all of those and we'll send those out to everyone who is registered. Now, I'd like to introduce you to our day 2 panelists. Dr. Danielle Johnson-Offei is the Executive Director of Durham's Partnership for Children and a Bank Street College Early Childhood Policy Fellow. Dr. Johnson-Offei's research focuses on collaborative action research, culturally responsive and sustaining instruction, and program design within the early childhood sector. We are going to share more about Dr. Johnson-Offei's bio in the chat. Welcome, Danielle. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Perfect. And we are also great. We're glad you're here. We're also joined by another Bank Street College Early Childhood Policy Fellow, Jamie Bonczyk. Did I say that right? Awesome. Jamie leads 80 by 3 Resilient from the Start, a systems change initiative at Greater Twin Cities United Way, focusing on ensuring early childhood in Minnesota focuses on ensuring every child in Minnesota experiences trauma-sensitive care in the critical first years of life. Jamie strives to create social impact networks, change initiatives, and partnerships that create sustainable health and education outcomes for children, families, and educators. We did have a third guest. We're not sure if they're able to make it, so if they do show up, we will introduce them and get them right into the conversation. But we are going to go get started because I'm sure that between myself, Danielle, and Jamie, we are going to give you a full 2 hours worth of talking about early childhood education and care, policy, practice, and quality. So let's get right to it. I want to thank you all for agreeing to be a part of today's panel discussion. Yesterday, we had a wonderful discussion where we were looking at the quality landscape, right? What's happening in terms of legislation. We had someone who's been working tirelessly in the state of Massachusetts to help get universal pre-K. We also looked at research and some of the issues of expanding early childhood into public schools through Dale Farron and the work that she's been doing out of Vanderbilt. And then we also we're looking at Oh wow, I just draw a blank on our third. Equity. Sorry, equity. Yes, we had Danielle Blevins from the Children's Equity Institute, really helping us keep grounded, right, in our focus on advocating for quality in terms of equity, and that's also our focus tomorrow. But we really wanted to talk about practice and policy today, and what better way to do that than with two, maybe three early childhood policy fellows from Bank Street College of Education. So as experts in oh wait, sorry. So also to prepare, no, I'm sorry, back up. I would like to begin by asking both of you to briefly share your current work in early childhood education and policy. So let's begin with you, Danielle, and then we'll go to you, Jamie. If you could just give us an overview of what the work you do looks like and how, yeah, just a little bit about that. It'll help us, everyone, get to know you a little bit.
Okay, so currently we're like literally having our ears on the ground because in North Carolina, our House and Senate, they are looking to pass their proposed budgets. And in that, we have what's called the child care, I'm drawing a blank. We have what's called the Child Care Compensation Grant. So that grant will help support parent fees, teacher compensation, and to support our providers in providing quality care. So as I was mentioning, there may be an email coming out fast and furious because that vote may have taken place last night. So we're going to be getting our directive going forward on how do we support, what will be the rally cry around this compensation grant. So I know, like, for example, the NCECE coalition will most likely be joining us, joining out in a webinar to kind of rally the troops together to, again, trying to fight to ensure that we are providing quality care for our families and to support our early child care system because our providers, again, they make up our system. So also in North Carolina, we have what's called the Smart Start Network. So my organization, Durham's Partnership for Children, is one of 75 of the local partnerships where we collectively come together. So again, identify these policy challenges, particularly around funding. Right now, I know we're all kind of buzzing around what would unrestricted funding look like to support our services, because as you know, with these restrictions, is but so much that you can do. So hopefully we're looking at some unrestricted funding support to allow us to continue to do evidence-based and evidence-informed work and support different programs around that. So that's kind of what we're looking at right now, along with maternal child health. So looking at how do we support our BIPOC community around, again, securing services such as doula support, midwives. How do we have policy to support women in obtaining these resources and having that to be sustainable throughout their pregnancy as part of their postpartum? So again, looking at policies and programs to support these efforts. One of the other things we're looking at again is, again, quality takes place in different settings. So wanting folks to understand that family child care home providers, that's a viable space. That's a viable option. So ensuring that we have policies to support funding for this viable space of our family child care home providers. So those are some of the three hot buzz policies work that we're working on currently in Durham and across North Carolina.
Thank you. We're definitely going to want you to follow up on that because you said a lot, and I thought I talked fast. I love it. Someone talking fast as I do. Yes. No, you're sorry. You're unmute yourself so we can hear you. There you go.
I was saying I'm a native New Yorker, so I try to remember that. I'm very animated with the hands and the fast, shoot out the bullets. So I will remember that
Not
for
a problem.
slow
No,
it
not a problem.
down.
I'm the same way. I've gotten better. But we're going to come back. Thank you for that quick overview. Jamie, can you tell us a little bit about the policy work that you're doing in Minnesota?
Yes, thanks for the question. So my current involvement in early childhood policy really centers around understanding and shaping conditions that drive positive change through co-creating with educators and people who are doing the work already. Specifically, I'm really focusing around equity by shifting the underlying conditions that perpetuate challenges in early childhood education. And this involves not only addressing the explicit policy changes, but also recognizing the more subtle and implicit factors that influence outcomes. So my work is aligned to the Waters of Systems Change framework. So we look at things like, what are the current practices? Of course, we're looking at policy changes. So those are big P, little p policy changes, looking at resource flows that are there. But we spend the majority and the bulk of our time really looking at the relationships and the power dynamic shifts that might need to happen. So even if we get a policy change, that it could be funded, it could be unfunded, but who's going to do the work, right? Like the people, we really want the relationships in a public-private partnership that allows for implementation. And we work on mental model shifts. So largely like the educators that I work with are being asked to do a public service. They're asked to be doing essentially social work at the same time as early childhood education and care. So what does that mean? And the way that so we look a lot about the way that we talk about the work and making sure that we're framing it positively, even though 80 by 3 Resilient from the start is talking a lot about early childhood traumatic experiences. So events and experiences that have disrupted development. We align to things like the adverse childhood experiences, but we want to counter that with positive, or what we would say benevolent childhood experiences. So much of our work is really around relationships, and knowing that relationships, they can only happen with early childhood educators if we have people in the field. So not only are we looking at all of these pieces, but recruitment and retention. What does it mean to have educators who are in, whether that's classrooms, family child care homes, really it could be family, friend, and neighbor, but also it could be home visitors. What does it mean for the people who are in relationship with children and families that have had some disruption in their life to be in a space of being a positive force for good? So that's largely like, what do I do every day? It's like playing Jenga with the waters, the systems change to say, what conditions need to be true for us to move forward, looking at positive policy changes or really influencing positive policy changes, but it doesn't stop there. What happens with the implementation, and how can the people who are going to be impacted the most by either being involved in a change or the forced change that sometimes comes to the field in creating or co-creating, what does it look like to move those policies into practices? So that's a little bit about what I do every day.
I love that. I love that both of you are talking about early childhood beyond just what happens in an early childhood classroom or setting, but it's still so critical to early years, right? To the initial years of a young child's development. So Danielle, I heard you talk about, infant maternal care, right? Doulas, that sort of thing, super important. Jamie, you're talking about trauma and ACEs and having people who understand that, right? And so I think that's so important because often we focus on what's happening in the early child classrooms, the preschool classrooms, the public school classrooms, the family daycare home providers, but it starts at birth. It starts at, before birth, right? And so we have to really think about policy that's impacting young children and their families throughout the lifespan, right? Starting in the early years. And all of these things sound super important, but almost often get lost sometimes, right? If our focus is just on education and care, which is important, right? But care needs to be more, right? So can you talk a little bit more about how you see your work impacting the work of early childhood education, right? In the classroom, working with teachers, what do you see as some of the connections between these types of policies that we might not think about being related to early childhood, but really greatly impact what teachers do and what children experience in our classrooms? Either one of you can jump in.
I feel really comfortable. Like, this is a space where it's a conversation that I'm in all day, every day. I have the benefit of being in space with Danielle for a year and really talking about what does this look like, feel like, sound like. So when I think about an early childhood educator, I should just preface, like, I've done a lot of things in my life, but I spent 10 years in classrooms directly working with children, and the conditions that are currently in classrooms around adverse childhood experiences. Like, what do I mean by some of those when I say is I have across my career, whether it was as a classroom teacher, whether it was as a Head Start administrator, an executive director, all these things I've done, I have worked with children and families that have been experienced incarceration, mental or substance health needs. I have worked with families that have experienced domestic violence, a variety of things that we would call, adverse childhood experiences. And when it comes down to being a classroom teacher, even though I had the best of intentions, and I luckily had formal mentors and I had a 4-year education, I was well-intentioned, but I was not well-equipped. And even though I came with some lived experience of a bunch of stuff that makes me well prepared to do this job and has sent me on a trajectory of studying family systems, social systems that make it so that it's not dependent, that a child's success is not dependent on their own family's ability to connect to resources, that there are more people. When it comes down to resourcing these educators, or leaders or family childcare homes, so much of this it's a system, Denisha. Like, it's not just one thing, right? So I think about, like, what are the family and community connections to resource the people who are in proximity to children? If you are in a center-based care, it can't just be like, what professional development are we offering to teachers? What leadership and management supports have been there? Like, I had to move from Minnesota to Chicago to seek a graduate degree that allowed me to study public administration, adult learning theory, and early childhood. And so it's some of these practices, like, we have yet to develop. What does it really mean to adequately support leaders doing this work? Of course, there's staff qualifications. If we talk about really resourcing individuals with healthy relationships or like attentive play partners, what does it mean that we have prepared the individual to be in, like deep, meaningful relationships, not just with a child, but with a family, especially if you have a different lived experience in that child or family, so that we are not unintentionally like perpetuating harm in any kind of classroom, because education is a system. It has absolutely been built to be easiest for people who are already prepared for that system. So what does it mean to really do, quality in a classroom? And looking at those quality of interactions, we need to better resource our workforce so that they can better resource the future. And it's not just a 2-generation approach. Early childhood isn't, I don't think. I think we're really thinking about a 7-generation impact in health, wealth, and education outcomes. So I just said a lot of things. I'm going to pause and like let Danielle like hop in on the conversation. But when we're fostering high quality early childhood, absolutely everything comes down to relationship and play. But do the people who are in relationship with children, do they have that information? Do they know how to do those things? And do they have the supports that they need? Because you can't give a drink from an empty cup.
And that's where I would love, excellent segue, Jamie, because again, you said, as you mentioned, you said a lot. And my main takeaway with that is, let's talk to the educators. We may, as the policy experts, as the ECE experts, we may think we know what they need, but let's talk to them. Let's come alongside. And that's been the approach at Durham's Partnership for Children, where we come alongside the educator, alongside the administrator, alongside the family, because we're fortunate to have the resources, the know-it-all, but it's what we have, what you need. So that's always our starting point of the conversation, is talking with that educator and saying, okay, we see where you are with your plan of study. What is it that you need, and how can what we have be provided to you and or secure those additional resources to support you? So we start there with the conversation and the relationship building first with the educator and with that administrator, because you don't want to disconnect. So you want to ensure that what's going on in the classroom conversation is also taking place between that educator and that administrator, because that's a terrible thing to have one perspective of the administrator, but then have these unrealistic expectations of their educator. So ensuring that we are all aligned with what are we expecting, what are the resources, and understanding that it's not a one size fit all. So what might work in classroom A with this professional practitioner may not be what classroom C needs. So how do we, again, modify and meet the needs of the educators with the resources that we do have, and or securing additional ones? I'm so honored and just really excited for the work that is taking place in our state and in our county, rather, with Durham Tech and CCSA, and how they have the apprenticeship program, where they're meeting with these high school students or these others, who may not be your traditional student, but who have a desire to want to be part of their early childhood practitioner and workforce. So working with them, again, understanding what are the needs. We understand that our children and families show up in different phases and stages of their lives. So how are we preparing our educators to meet those families and our administrators to support them along their child's trajectory and journey of just navigating early childhood? The way you raise child number one may be very different from that third child. So how are we meeting the needs of those families through our educators, through reflective practice and their coaching approaches? So we're very fortunate at the partnership. I love to say that we are like a continuum of care, because we are the grantee for Early Head Start. We are the NC Pre-K contract administrator. So we're able to work with teachers across the spectrum of early childhood and really try to meet them where they are, to bring the resources and needs that they need to support children and families within their classroom and early childhood environment.
I love that. I think what both of you are describing, well, a couple of things, right? I think what I hear from Jamie is the need to give teachers the resources. You said something, and I should have wrote it down, but you said like how you were capable, but you didn't have the skill, like you didn't have what you needed, right? And so we have this profession, we have all of these people. So part of the work of these policy organizations, these initiatives, is to give the teachers what they need. But on the second hand, I think what Danielle's talking about is the village model, right? We can't just leave it on the teacher and the family. It takes so many organizations and people in this village to support young children. So how do we grow that village, right? How do we have organizations who are giving out the early Head Start, but also the infant support to the mom, right? And the doula, the birth, right? How are we giving out the mental health supports to the educators, to the families, or even that support if you're on your third child, right? To a family, how are we giving you the individualized support you need, right? I think one of the things that we challenge is that we put everything on the backs of education and teachers to solve all of these challenges. And what early childhood should show us, when early childhood policy should show us, that we really have to be working in a collaborative partnership with lots of different people, right? Young children need lots of support from lots of different organizations and people, and so do families, right? And I think it sounds that's what you guys, like some of the work that you guys are doing, and I just want to emphasize that so we can get out of these silos where it only has to be this way. I feel like a lot of the pushes around policy right now on expanding access to early childhood care and education is to funnel it into just one way, right? And so we spent a lot of time yesterday talking about one size does not fit all, right? Someone said Dale was critiquing public schools in California who are going to have 3 and 4 year olds, and they're not ready. They don't have bathrooms in the classroom. They don't have the setup where there's a door to go outside. They can't eat in the room. They're not ready for young children. Someone said, well, what should we do? Put them somewhere else, right? Why does it have to be that the expansion only happens in this one setting, right? What happens when we think about those family daycare home providers and it helping them expand, right? Or the private institutions and the smaller childcare centers, right? What are some other things? Even adults, just caring adults. What if we funded more and more people to go in and provide care and provide that support in families' homes, right? And not necessarily in institutional settings. We know so much that we have to get out of the binary, but I think it's hard, right? People get caught up in that. It has to be this one way. It has to be standardized, and that's not good, right? That's not good for children. So I hope I got the summary right, but I just wanted to highlight those points because I think they're super important. Anything else before we move on to the next question? Yeah, Danielle.
You definitely did. And it's one of the reasons why I'm so just enamored with collaborative action research, because it looks at that. It looks at how do we create this safety net, this support, where we are dismantling those silos and ensuring that, and it's something that you mentioned, we have to come to the ground. I think sometimes policymakers are so far removed from the work and those on the ground that they don't understand. So they think it's a good idea, as you mentioned, in California, to put classrooms for 3 and 4 year olds when they're not fully equipped to meet those needs of those 3 and 4 year olds. So I think, again, ensuring that policymakers and those in those spaces are hearing from the ground and understanding that work, so that when they are making these policies, they're understanding the implications and the impact it will have, and really listen to the voice of those on the ground doing the work.
Absolutely. And also to be flexible, right? I think sometimes you hear from one person and you think, okay, that's the answer. There is no one solution to all of this. I tell my students, look, if there was a solution, I would have bottled it up and sold it for millions already. There isn't one. And anyone who tells you they have one is suspect, right? Because I don't know what the needs of this group of children is compared to this group of children, right? It's always going to vary. In the city, right? In New York City, the kids in Queens might need something different than the kids in Manhattan. Across the Northeast, the kids in Boston might need something different than the kids in New Hampshire, and across the country, right? North Carolina families might need different things than Minnesota families, right? And so we want to listen to people, but also not limit that and say, oh, well, it worked for you, it's going to work for everyone, which we kind of know intuitively when we know young children, right? We know that even our own children, right? Our 4-year-old children are very different, right? First, second, third, whatever child are very different even at the same age. And so how do we bring that into our work? Well, this is off to a great start. I want to keep us going. I want to share a little bit about some of the research we did to prepare for the Summer Institute. So we did some research on survey because on quality, because I too wanted to hear from practitioners and parents and people who don't always talk about quality because they're left out of the conversation, right? Quality is supposed to matter to families. Quality is something teachers should be concerned about, and many are. but we rarely hear from them. So we instituted a survey and did some focus groups. And I wanted to just share a couple of things to frame our conversation. So hopefully you're seeing up on your screen, these were some important factors in assessing quality that we asked teachers to tell us about, to rate, right? So I'm going to drop these as well into the chat so that you can see them. But we asked teachers to tell us about these different factors, right? And to tell us which ones were really important to them and which ones weren't, to get a sense. And so I'm sorry, we should say we had 200 respondents in the survey. 85 of them were early childhood teachers. We had a bunch that were just parents, and we had some that were neither teachers or parents at this time. So I just want to mention that. And then here we go. So I'm going to drop these in here so you can see them clearly. That was the first group. And then, and so we asked them to kind of rank these. Not rank, like they could put as many as you want, but like what are the factors, right? And so up next, you'll see how they talked about these. And so what I did was group the top 5 and bottom 5 factors in assessing quality, so you can get a sense of what those look like, right? So at the top 5, teacher-child ratio, teacher staff knowledge of child development, and a commitment to play were ranked the highest. 79 out of 85 people, 93% of the population said that those were super important. Right following those were commitment to social and emotional development, emphasis on natural environment and movement, and inclusion of diverse children and families, right? So that's our top 6 of those factors that are in the chat that you saw on the first slide. Then when we get to the bottom ones, the ones that didn't seem too important for assessing quality, accredited by a national organization, right? So when we talk about quality, there's this whole system of measurement, which I think muddies the waters, right? And so that becomes an issue. And it's not as important to some folks. Suspension and expulsion rates was rated kind of lower. Commitment to academic preparation, right? This whole idea that we're supposed to be preparing them for kindergarten and college here we're ready was only seen important by 10 people, 11, almost 12% of the folks who responded. And then use of commercial curriculum, such as creative curriculum, was the lowest, right? And so often what people think is important about about quality doesn't always end up being what's easily measured, right? And what's people think about. And it's so broad, right? It's a broad idea, this idea of quality. We know we want it, but what does that actually mean? As experts in policy, what key elements do you think play a role in fostering high quality early childhood education and care? And this time we'll go ahead and begin with you, Jamie, and then we'll transition to Danielle.
So I'm just going to say that I 100% agree with these top 5. That in order to understand what is typical or atypical in a classroom, a family childcare home, in your own home, you absolutely have to understand child development. Because if you understand child development, you know how to foster child development for the, to support what is happening next. We might call that scaffolding or something else if we're using in, the field like lingo. But when it comes down to supporting children who may have had disruption, and that might be because they have something going on genetically, it could be an event or experiences that cause disruption. How do we connect children and families to supports to help children? We might use the words early intervention or something like connect to other supports if that's necessary. You absolutely need to understand child development to know what to do if we're not seeing child development in a way that we would expect. Play. I spent a couple of years being supported by the Life is Good Playmakers Foundation and becoming, I can't even remember what the name of whatever we became, Playmakers. But absolutely. And when I think about what are the things that really support children who have had negative events or experiences, disruption, adverse childhood experiences, however we want to call that, play and healthy play is so important to helping children process those experiences, helping them to find out and move that on from this is something that happened. It's not who they are. So active play is so important. I think about social and emotional learning, critical to identity formation, understanding who you are, having self-confidence, being able to move through the world, thinking about outdoor play and movement. Again, those are important for executive functioning. And though executive functioning is around planning and making choices. But when we think about healthy executive functioning later on, again, those are tied to academic achievement, wealth building opportunities in your life, and health outcomes. When we do not have all of these things, we can actually shorten people's lives. So it's not just like good or bad binary conversation. This is really about talking about who does and who doesn't get experiences. The one thing I'll say that I don't necessarily agree with on the quality is preschool suspension and expulsion, to me, is absolutely an indicator of quality, but we don't usually call it that. We say something like, our program doesn't have the resources to meet the needs of your child. And then we will put that onus on the family, often a family of needs, and often a family that has had trauma in their life. And then we just ask them to go somewhere else. I know, coming from a Head Start background, that like often doesn't happen in places that are publicly funded. But when we look at family childcare or center-based childcare that are expected to be a public good, but don't have the resources, and most of them actually want to do the right thing, but they don't have access to inclusion coaches, don't have access to paras, don't have access to professional development, don't have access to budgets that would support inclusion, it makes it really hard to have those high quality experiences for everyone.
Yeah, I thought the same thing around the issue around suspension and expulsion. I'm going to drop a link in the chat to an article that I actually published with one of our co-founders, Diane Levin, about preschool suspensions. And I remember when we wrote it, right, I got a lot of pushback from teachers. And I don't suspend children. So like when you're looking at a list of what matters in quality and you're a teacher and you see suspension and expulsions, you're less likely to, because you feel like people are blaming you, right? And I said, look, I get it. I was a kindergarten teacher and I had two boys stab each other with pencils and break the skin and were bleeding. And in a moment of panic, I just sent them to the principal's office so I could figure out what was getting myself together in the classroom. I just needed them to go for a minute. And so I go to get them, and the principal, I sent them home. They're suspended. And I was like, what? What are you talking about? I just needed you to take them out of the classroom for 5 minutes. No, they broke the skin. It's an automatic suspension. I did not know that sending two boys to the principal for help was going to lead to them to get suspended. Trust and believe I never sent a child to the principal's office again, because that was awful. Like, that's not what I wanted. I get that sometimes it's out of our control. Our directors, our principals might do that, but we are part of that pipeline, right? So suspensions and expulsions tend to happen based on the challenges we're having in classrooms with children, right? And it is an indicator of quality. And I'm not saying we're blaming teachers. I'm saying teachers need more resources so that suspension and expulsions don't have to be turned to, right? But it is an indicator of quality, right? And people should think about that. Yeah, so some folks are talking about that in the chat. But Danielle, please share with us your quality factors.
As you were talking about that, I just came to mind, were those children acting out play? Were they being Jedi from Star Wars? Were they being swordsmiths? So again, understanding typical development and activity, although it may not have been safe, that may have been a typical activity to act like you're a Jedi and someone's Darth Vader and someone's the, Luke Skywalker, whatever have you. They're acting that out. So understanding that, and then how do you redirect their attention to do something that is safer, but understanding that as part of development for boys, for girls, however, they will act out and role play with pencils, crayons. But again, that goes back to what you were saying, Jamie, and understanding child development. Many teachers, I wonder, have they forgotten what is typical development? What is the typical stage that is just naturally occurring with this child, and you're deeming it as a punitive action when that may just be a typical development for the child. So I'm just wanting to add to that. I'm really big on relationship. I believe that nothing can take place, nothing can be sustained without relationship. So for me, quality would be just establishing and cultivating true relationships that centers the child and family. So understanding who is this child and family coming into my classroom, and that takes place before day one of them entering into your classroom. I'm so proud of the work that our child care providers do in Durham County, where they have play dates before school starts to get to know the child, to get to know the family, to understand the different dynamics that this family is being impacted by or experiencing. And then from there, when they come into a warm welcome into that classroom environment, it should be a good transition, to just, again, understanding that's part of that quality, that transitioning into the classroom and transitioning into this formalized setting of childcare. So really big on that relationship piece. Also understanding, again, I got to go back to the whole professional development for pre-service, in-service, for our educators and administrators. That is a necessity. That should not be a one-time year where you hit a pinata and hope some trainings fall out. It should be very intentional that you're meeting with your team teachers, as administrators, and vice versa, where the administrators are meeting with their peers and colleagues to understand what is best practice, what is, the new approach to providing quality that we can implement into our settings and modify it based on who our parents and children are. Because again, as we mentioned earlier, it is not a one fit all. So understanding what that professional development looks like and being intentional about it and really coming alongside teachers so that they are not feeling as though they are, the lone ranger in this space, and the burden and grunt of this experience, childcare experience, lies on their shoulders. But it's a collective that we're coming again alongside the children, the families, and the educators and the environmental setting where the education is taking place. Also, just wanted to add to that, helping educators understand and be self-aware. I think we've kind of gotten away from that self-awareness. How am I showing up? What are my blind spots? What am I biased to? And really, being intentional and doing the work on self to truly show up to support children and families. Also, that's that. You heard when you read my bio, so you already know where I'm going to go. Culturally responsive and sustaining and anti-bias curriculums, but also assessments. Because what I'm finding is that we're doing the curriculum piece, but we're forgetting the assessment. So how are we aligning that assessment to also be culturally responsive and anti-bias? Because if not, it's all for naught. We have this curriculum, but are we truly assessing the child's development through the same lens? So really understanding that. And then also lastly, I would just add is just understanding, again, as we mentioned earlier, the collaborative approach. It is not a siloed approach. So making those connections where you're bringing in parks and recs into your classroom space, where you're taking the children out into the Museum of Life and Sciences, but you're bridging those community resources and pushing that into the classroom, as well as making bridges for at home into the classroom and into the community.
I love that. So much great stuff. But Jamie and Danielle, we're going to pause because Suzette made it. Welcome, Suzette. So glad you could join us. I'm going to read a bit of your bio, and then I'll get you caught up with the questions that we were just talking about. So Suzette Espinoza-Cruz is a senior early education program specialist for the Seattle Department of Education and Early Learning and a Bank Street College Early Childhood Policy Fellow. She has dedicated 25 plus years of her professional career to supporting equitable policy in childcare and early learning at the local, state, and national level, with a specific focus on pay equity for early child care workers, supporting children's home culture and language, and ensuring universal access to high quality early learning for all children. We're so glad to have you, Suzette. And so we'd like for you to also, so in the beginning, Jamie and Danielle both situated their current work around policy. So as your introduction, can you tell us a little bit about the current work that you're doing around policy in early childhood?
Thank you, Denisha. I'd be happy to do that. So in my current role with the City of Seattle and the Department of Education and Early Learning, I am tasked with supporting roughly 250 early learning and child care programs serving children birth to age 12. And some of the work that I am doing really is about
I'm sorry, Suzette, is there any chance you can turn up the volume? I can hear you, but I'm seeing in the chat that people can't hear you. So I don't know if you can, or Felicia, if you guys can boost it. That's better. Yes, that's better.
Okay. So in my current work, what I'm doing is I'm supporting child care programs birth to 12 years old in the City of Seattle, Department of Education and Early Learning. So we do have a universal pre-kindergarten program that we are doing, and our pre-kindergarten program has been divorced from our child care program. Child care program is separate, this child care assistance program. And in the child care assistance program, what we do is we support child care providers so that they can provide high quality child care for children, for families who qualify for City of Seattle voucher. So in our city, we have a separate child care support voucher for parents that they can use if they need assistance after they've used state assistance. So if they are part of the state's child care subsidy program, which is paid through the CBGG dollars, then if they don't qualify for the state program, then if they can apply for the City of Seattle program, and they can work with the City of Seattle. And so what I have been doing with my fellowship is I've been really looking at quality from the lens of operations and what quality looks like for the staff that are working in early learning and childcare programs. So often we tend to, in with the latest, QIRS work that's been going on in our state and also across the nation, childcare quality, childcare programming and early learning programming is rooted in how the children perceive quality, right? So what is all the quality measures are really from the gaze of the child in that
Mhm.
classroom and what the child is experiencing in the classroom. What we haven't done a good enough job in is looking at how quality is impacting the staff, right? And so what is the staff's experience in that early learning quality space as they are tasked to maintain that quality? And so I am really excited to share some of the work that I've been doing, um, utilizing the research from the Center for Childcare Employment. And so that's what I'm doing. That's where I'm at. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I apologize. I know I can hear you perfectly. I don't know how Jamie and Danielle, if they're able to hear all that. Hopefully they are. But I know there's still some issues around it being low, but we apologize for that. But we did also want to ask you. So we just talked about, when you joined us, we were talking about key elements that you think play a role in fostering high quality early childhood education and care. And so I shared some of our research and we talked about that. And then we were just wrapping up. Danielle was talking about relationships and collaboration. Given that you're looking at the operations side in Seattle, is there anything else you think? We talked about play, about relationships, about being centering the children, about equity, about centering culture, race, and all of these things. But anything else that you might want to add there?
It's really important. All of those things that we're looking at for children, right? Equity, and are in the classroom, professional development, a lot of the things that we do intuitively for children, ensuring that they are seen in the space and that the space belongs to them and that they are honored in that space and they are welcomed in that space. Those are all the same things that we also need to be doing for the adults that are working in the program. Right? The adults need to also know that this is a place that is safe for them. This is a space that is welcoming for them. This is a space where they're going to be valued and where they're going to be respected, and where they're doing really important work, right? And we touched a little bit upon this yesterday about how what is the history? What is the history of childcare? What is it? What is the basis? What is the root? And how do we move from this disparate idea of work that is being done by a vast majority of women of color, women who are refugee and immigrant women. Some men are entering the field now, but the majority of the lion's share of the work that's happening across the nation is happening in the in and the work is being done by BIPOC, refugee and immigrant folks, in service of the children who are in their communities. And so if we want to do right by those communities, then we need to be doing right by the folks who are working in those communities. And that means pay parity. That means living wages. That means that people have retirements. One of the things that I'm really interested in learning more research or diving into more research about is what, as our workforce is aging and getting closer to retirement, how many of our early learning and care folks can retire? How many of them have either working for organizations that have made investments in 401ks or that sort of financial thing. We don't really talk a whole lot about what does the benefits package look like for those who are entering retirement. What sort of health care support are they going to have, right? And so we don't want people to be graduating out of or retiring out of the workforce and having to live a subpar life, right? We want people to have we want them to thrive in
Yeah.
retirement, and to be able to volunteer and do the things that brings their hearts joy, right? And that shouldn't be something that's reserved only for those with means. It shouldn't be something that's reserved for folks who have the privilege to afford that.
I love that focus because we're talking about quality in terms of policy and practice. And one of the things we don't want to leave out of the conversation is that practice also means the working conditions of our early childhood workforce, right? All of our early childhood, whether you're a family daycare home provider, whether you work in a center or you're a director or you're a public school teacher or you're support specialist, private, religious, whatever, it doesn't matter, right? You're part of this workforce and our support of you, right, is about the quality, right? In funny, in a lot of the activism work I did in education that wasn't just focused on early childhood, we always said teachers' working conditions are children's learning conditions, but yet somehow we don't apply that to early childhood. Somehow it's okay for a woman to work in a place that she can't afford to send her own children to, right? Like what are the issues around that? Or that doesn't give her the flexibility to care for her own children and work there at the same time, right? And so how do we think about those systems in place and how that quality impacts them is really important. So thank you for that. So based on yesterday's conversation, it is clear that the relationship between policy and quality remains unclear, right? A lot of times, people don't understand that a policy might be driving that, right? Or might be interfering with quality or might be trying to improve the quality, right? There's a lot happening because policies are very different, right? They come up at the local level, the state level, the federal level, and they can be influenced by many different things, and then how they are then implemented can vary as well too. So, in what ways do you see policy directives facilitating improvements in the quality of early childhood education and care? This could be through your research as a fellow or your current work right now, but I really want to help people understand who are listening, right? What are some examples of this was a policy and it really helped improve the quality so that we can, just paint a bigger picture of what that might look like in different contexts. So why don't we start with Jamie, then we'll go to Danielle, and then we'll go to Suzette.
I just want to start by saying I absolutely agree with everything that Suzette said. It still is a little hard for me to hear you, Suzette, but I just tuned in my ears of I've heard a lot of things in my life. And so just paying attention, but some things that you really that I heard you talk about that I'm not just here as a person who knows about this because I read about it in a book. I benefited directly from public student loan forgiveness. So I am a person who was able to take advantage of that, but only because I made $10.25 an hour to be a community healer for 10 years, right? So the complexity of what you're saying. I also, Denisha, to your point, was a mom that couldn't afford to put my own child. My child is 11 and a half. She went to about 1.5 years of childcare in her whole life. My husband had to quit his job because why can't I make the money and the difference, right? So we had to make some different things, and I've had to make decisions. I don't work in a classroom anymore. I now work in philanthropy to try to redirect funding to make sure that other people don't have to have my same lived experience for them to be well cared for. So I think that there's a couple of things here I'd just like to say. One, if you are working in an organization that is a nonprofit, your board of directors should absolutely be figuring out how to pull down resources that are federally or state funded to support the educators in their programs. But that would absolutely mean that board of directors need to understand the complexity to put that in their strategic plans and their financial management of the organization. So I sat on a podcast with Art Rolnick. He formerly was of the Minneapolis Fed, and talked about the interactions of the boards, brains, and budgets. So at some point, we'll get that into the chat in case somebody wants to go down the rabbit hole of what does it mean for board of directors to be involved here. In the state of Minnesota, we have a Great Start compensation package. We have provided state funding to step in where the ARPA funds stopped federally to ensure that we were able to continue to provide compensation packages to educators in the classrooms, because $10.25 an hour was absolutely not. I mean, I know there's been inflation in some cost of care, but when we are asking people to essentially be providing really therapeutic preschool, in some cases, we are asking for therapeutic preschool and we are paying for bare minimum health and safety. They're not the same thing. So we really need to think about how do we make sure. And when we think about what does it mean to be well, in Minnesota, we have early childhood mental health consultation. I think many states have that, especially tying it to the previous conversation on preschool suspension and expulsion. But the work that I'm doing around 80x3 Resilient from the start, we started working with a mental health organization that provides culturally responsive and congruent supports to our educators with no diagnosis, no insurance. We are just like paying them for on-site supports because our educators often are drawn to the field to protect children from experiences that they've had themselves without ever getting the opportunity to heal from that. So we don't want people working from their wound, right? Like that's a Brene Brown thing. I didn't come up with that phrase, but it is really important that we resource people for all of their well-being, financial, academic, joy. We want joy, right? Like it's so important that we have joy and well-being to continue to do the work so it's sustainable. And so I think to kind of like answer your question is like, we need more, but we don't just need more of anything. We need more intentionality, and we need less siloed or fragmented approaches to really thinking about how do we make sure that the people who are in the classrooms are so well cared for that what they give is an abundance of joy and love in their attentional play partnering and the way in which they can develop relationships, because behaviors may challenge you, but when they're actually triggering an event or an experience in your own life, that is setting everybody up for failure when we don't really resource the people who are doing the most important work in our communities.
Thank you, Jamie. So much powerful stuff there. Yeah, Danielle, what are your thoughts?
So my thoughts is a lot, because again, when you were mentioning, and Suzette was talking on it as well, you know, we're paying some of our educators unlivable wages where they're having to take on 2 and 3 jobs just to support their families and getting burnt out and wanting to leave the field. And that then causes the next generation to not even want to enter into the field. So we have to really be mindful about that. And I'm really concerned about just sometimes a disconnect. You know how, for example, we receive federal funding for our early Head Start. That comes chock full of different requirements that support educators through mental health services, through wages, comparable wages, and things like that. But then you have your local level dollars, which kind of get stuck, if you will. You know, they can't, you really can't go as far. So you have to get really creative on how you braid these funds together to ensure that what one sector is receiving, you can then transfer that over into the other spaces. So in a way to do that, we have what's called our wages in Durham County throughout North Carolina, which is a partnership with CCSA and the Smart Start local partnerships, where we do a wage supplement for educators so that can supplement their salaries. So that is funded through, again, Smart Start funds, which are state funds. So that's a way to try to bring about some equity of what we can do in our federal classrooms that are early Head Start, then our state funded classrooms as well. So just really trying to look at that balance of how do we bring all of these services and resources, particularly around mental health and wellness for our educators. It's becoming a very heavy lift. And how do we ensure their mental stability and wellness while also fostering just additional outlets and supports for them? So looking at ways to bring those into our spaces is something that we're looking at, again, through an equitable approach, that even though our federal funded classrooms will receive the same as our state funded classrooms. So ensuring that we're finding ways to do that. And Jamie, you hit the nail on the head, because I had a conversation with my board chair just around this whole equity piece, because things are so different based on your funding streams. So how do we get creative? How do we get innovative to ensure that we are doing this across the board? So we're definitely taking that charge to heart and looking at how do we, and also making it sustainable. That's another thing. How is it going to be sustainable? Because funding, as you know, may not be reoccurring. So you may receive this fat funding this year, but how do you then forecast and find resources to support it to be sustainable to carry you through? So that's what we're looking at.
I love those ideas, because I think it's important to take what you have, right? So you have this pay that's not enough, and then add to it and not put it on the parents. Often we think that parents should be paying the salaries of childcare, and we know that's not sustainable either, right? I have friends in family childcare, and they don't want to raise salaries, for their parents. But at the end of the day, at the end of the year, when they do their books, they're at a loss, right? They don't bring in any income. They can barely pay their employees and barely have anything it's like they're running a volunteer childcare business out of their home, because it's not bringing any income, right? That's not sustainable. but they can't say to the parents who are already paying good money for the care to pay more, right? So wouldn't it be great if either the local or the state or the federal or someone came in and said, all right, we're going to match what you're getting. We're going to give you, you deserve this amount, and we're going to fill in the gap. And a lot about that is just filling in the gap for what's already there, right? That idea of a safety net and things like that are super important. And then I think also the focus on just really thinking about that. Joy, I almost wanted to scream when you said that, Jamie, right? Like, yes, how are we, if we invest in our early childhood education carers and providers, if we make their lives better, they will ultimately be in bettering the lives of children, right? And so if we think, what can we do to bring joy into the lives of the people caring for children? We're on the right track, right, in terms of quality. So thank you both. Suzette, we'd love to hear from you and hear about any policy directives or initiatives that are facilitating improvement in quality early childhood education and care.
So look, Denisha, thank you so much to everyone else on the panel too, because I think one of the things that I want to highlight here is that if we didn't learn anything from the pandemic and the close downs and the lockdowns, is that childcare and early learning is foundational. Childcare and early learning is the backbone of our economy. I remember spending the early days in the shutdown working out of my basement in my home, talking to family childcare providers, talking to childcare centers, asking them, could they please remain open? Could they please figure out a way to work within the CDC guidelines so that they could care for the children of essential workers so that our whole economy and our whole city did not shut down? So that's one of the things that's real. It's true. Policies, like you said, I love this idea of what if we're thinking about the early learning and childcare being the essential backbone of the economy of not just of our states but also of our nation, then why are we not doing more to have a public-private investment? Here in Washington State, we recognize some of that, and we were successful in getting a capital gains tax legislation for a state capital gains tax passed and approved, and that funding for that capital gains tax is going into education. It's going into early learning. It's going into childcare. Right now, we've got a lot of pushback against that, and we're in a fight now to keep that legislation in place. There are some community folks with deep pockets who are pushing against that legislation, and they are proposing this initiative to repeal the capital gains tax, which would take out millions of, hundreds of millions of dollars that have been and will continue to go into funding childcare and early learning. Policy is a big piece, and advocacy is a huge piece of what we need to do, I think, as a field. And advocacy is something that needs to come in lots of different levels. It needs to come from the parents. It needs in unity with the folks who are doing the work. The family childcare folks, the childcare center folks. It's scary to think about how this nation really is pushing toward more commercialization of childcare, more of the capitalist approach, business approach to childcare and early learning, where it really is a common public good. So as a common public good, just like public education in the K-12, historically, we didn't always have kindergarten as part of a full public education. Now kindergarten is seen across the nation as standard. We start at 5 and we go from there. So why can't we see childcare and early learning also as a public good that anyone has the right to access and gets the funding to do so? So there really does need to be this push toward a public and private investment, because like they said back in the 90s when I was in the classroom, parents can't afford to pay, teachers can't afford to stay. There's got to be a better way. So that was our mantra during the Worthy Wages days and the campaigns back in the mid to late 90s. And the sad thing is that mantra still holds true today. All
Yeah,
these
it does.
years later.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I hear people in the chat, talking about pay wages and disparities in pay, and I understand the sentiment, but I don't like to fuel the debate over, well, you're a babysitter, or you're a family daycare home provider, you're a teacher, and right. Like, I know we're tied up in that because in America we're so very much, everybody thinks that the burger flipper doesn't deserve what the manager gets, right? But we gotta get back to the base. This is about caring for young children, and everybody who cares for young children everybody deserves a living wage. Like, first of all, I'll just say that. But everyone who cares for young children at any point in their life deserves a living wage, right? And so I think we build better off of solidarity, right? The bus drivers, the cafeteria workers, the early childhood teachers, the directors, the regular teachers, the after school providers, the respite care workers, doesn't matter, right? We need to collaboratively work together to ensure we all are earning a living wage. Because if we start like pushing against each other, well, my work is more important than your work, and we're not going to, they let us fight amongst each other, and let us divide up the crumbs that then they throw it our way, instead of us really unifying and saying, no, we're in this for children. Children and their families need this, and we deserve this, right? And so I just want to encourage us to kind of think about how we can be stronger together, right? I don't want to distance myself from the family daycare home provider or the third grade teacher, right? They are both in this work together. Both everything that they do is so important. Same thing with the high school teacher, right? Everything that they're doing is super important, and we need to band together and stop letting these structures divide us, right? Into thinking some of the work is more worthy than others. So yeah, let's keep going and talking about all of these amazing things around policy and practice. I think that was really helpful. I want to go back to the survey. So we talked about concerns about quality. I wanted to hear some of the concerns that people were having. So you're going to see this on the screen, and I'm going to read this out loud just so you can follow along. So I thought this was a good summary. This is one of our survey responses, and I thought this was one of the best summaries that we said. This person said, we've lost our way in this country when it comes to educating children, especially the young. We have lost the personal touch a teacher brings to the classroom. We've lost the art of teaching and therefore lost the art of learning. Teachers facilitate learning when they can be creative, listen to their students, make observations, pivot, shift, and change when needed. We've lost the personal touch to teaching and learning. We've forgotten what it feels like to discover and learn something new. How the body reacts, the wonder of it, how it elevates us, grows us, feeds us as an experience, everyone should have the right to know and feel. If we could actually find our way back to the art of teaching and learning, we wouldn't have to worry about quality so much. We should be creating spaces for our young that are safe, child-centered, and developmentally appropriate. Just because the government says it's a quality preschool doesn't always mean it's good for children or teachers. And it certainly doesn't mean it's a preschool using the best practices appropriate for their population of families. So I thought that was a great summary. I could have wrote that myself, right? But I did not. A couple others just to share with you briefly. So we have one that says too many programs look to quantitative rather than qualitative factors and disregard developmental appropriateness. I'm concerned about the schoolification of young children. I thought that really tied in well to our conversation yesterday about the issue of expansion of preschool and childcare into public schools. And someone else said too much emphasis on rubrics, whether for child development assessment or teacher provided assessments. They take away time and energy for ongoing iterative reflection and planning. And the direction of state approved professional development trainings are too focused on outside experts instead of providing credit for internal team reflection and knowledge sharing. So I thought they brought up general concerns that I saw across all of the responses, that those three kind of highlighted it, right? Teachers aren't allowed to do what they know and want to do intuitively, which is to teach and build relationships and observe and learn with children, right? And then we're so much focused on what's easily measured in quality and not the actual work. So the quantitative over the qualitative. And the last one about the focus on rubrics and assessments, and that we're not spending enough time really helping teachers understand that quality is a deeply reflective practice, right? You have to really question quality. I gave a keynote for Bank Street for the Infancy Institute, and one woman came up after me, and she was concerned about her practices with special needs children and how she might be stifling them because she's so concerned about their behaviors. And I said, the fact that you're even reflecting on your actions tells me you're not. You're stifling them when you have to, but you reflect on it, right? You're engaging in that highly reflective practice to question what you're doing. And that's how I know you're doing a good job, because the ones who don't even question it are the ones that are not being reflective, right? They're not thinking about how do I get better, right? So if we know all of these things impact quality, but we know teachers don't often have time to reflect. When are you supposed to, in the 25th hour of the day after you spent the other 24 hours doing everything that you can, right? There's not enough time built into that, right? And so I just wanted to share those with you as we think about our next question, which is what do you think we get wrong about policy, or what challenges do we face in the field in regards to ensuring high quality early childhood education care for all? Suzette, you talked a little bit about that. So why don't we start with Danielle, then we'll come to Suzette, and then we'll go to Jamie.
So first of all, those quotes that you provided in a nutshell is excellent. It truly displays exactly, what is quality. And we've gotten so far removed from that. And like I said, trying to find rubrics, doing the quantitative pieces and forgetting the qualitative. But I would say policies sometimes can do those unintentional or unintended harm. Because we're coming from a good place, as they always tell us, we come from good intentions. We're coming from a place of good intention, that we squelch, that we stifle, that we don't allow this space and opportunity for our children to truly just continue in awe and curiosity. And we then stifle that of the educators and that they become too afraid to teach, where it becomes like, well, if it's not on the quality checklist, can I do that? If it doesn't fall within that paradigm of what I've been conformed to believe of, this is the only way, the only method and approach of quality, does that stifle my true ability as an educator and that intrinsic skill that I bring to this work and to this approach? So I find that, the challenges with policy is that it can squelch, it can stifle true innovation, creativity. And it's like, again, we say it's coming from a place of good intention, but how do we, as I always say, marry the two? How do we marry requirements and innovation? And how do we then bring that in with some curiosity and just the awness of it all? I think we're really losing that, and we really are trying to recenter and get back to that child guidance, that child led, where the child leads us, where the family leads us and tells us, here's where I am coming in. Here's, my point of entry into this early child care system, and how can you come and you support me? So understanding that we each come with strengths and really elevating that. And even though that strength may not align with our checklist of quality, we have to acknowledge and honor that. How do we, again, allow those lived experiences of the child, of the family, to, again, be coupled in with those requirements and with the whole experience of education that sometimes our policy forget? It forgets about that lived experience. It forgets about that generational approach where you may have this family who are in a multi-generational household, and the strength and the resources that are found within that, where some may see that as calling them undeemed homeless, when that may not be the case. But because it doesn't fit into that checklist, of what a standard household should look like. So again, I think we sometimes have to be mindful that we don't allow ourselves to get boxed into these requirements. We honor them and we meet them because if we want our funding, we have to. But you do it in a manner that doesn't diminish the child, their experience, and who they are, and who that educator is. That educator has gone to school, that has, as they say, I've done my due diligence, and I'm coming in from a place of wanting to pour out my giftings into my classroom environment, into my community, to really elevate and support young children. How do we honor that while still meeting these policies and different requirements?
Yeah, I love that. I think it's that we talked about it yesterday, being flexible. We need flexibility, right? We need to have a basis understanding child development, family needs. A checklist that's more of a guidance, but not mandate, right? Something that's this is what you should be working towards, right? And then you having the ability to say, and this is how I do that, right? But it's so hard, right? Because that's a system that's not as easy as just let someone come in and observe and check, 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 check. You're high quality or you're not, right? But we know those systems are tough as well too. Suzette, tell us a little bit about your thoughts around what we get wrong, the policy limitations, maybe, right, when it comes to quality.
So one of the wonderful things that I got to experience being a Bank Street College fellow is that we learned a lot about systems and systems work and complex systems, and we also had an opportunity to get some grounding in liberatory design as part of our equity work, and thinking about how to co-design and design systems that actually work for communities. And I think, coming from a 20 2 years of working in municipal government, there are, you see the complexities of the system. You see the pitfalls of the system. Oftentimes, a lot of what we want is we need to have a way to justify our investments, right? And in justifying those investments, we need to do what we call uh, we want to anchor policies to um, some rigorous research, right? Rigorous academic research that's going to show us outcomes for our investment. And when we start looking at what does that rigorous research look like? Right? What is the academic research? And we touched on this a little bit yesterday, about, who gets the right to say what best practice is for any community. And I think, sometimes that's where one of the biggest pitfalls of policy is when we start anchoring academic research in other places to solutions in where we are at. It might not always work the same way in Boston as it works in New York, or as it works in New Mexico, or as it works in the Pacific Northwest. So we need to really look at how are we taking what that academic rigorous research says, and then using things like liberatory design, like co-design, like participatory action research, where you actually are coming and engaging communities to help co-design solutions for their own communities. Because there are things around early childhood practices that are culturally based and that have been shown to have wonderful outcomes for children for millennia. We have a very large indigenous population here, urban indigenous population here in the Seattle area, and there are cradle board practices for infants and toddlers that help to create closeness and attachment, and the wearing of babies on the mother or the caregiver. Those are indigenous cultural practices in many different cultures. Yet we are hearing from other research that says babies need to be able to be allowed to be left alone to explore, to roll around. And it's like, yes, there are times when babies do need to have that independence, but there are also times that they need to be securely attached. And when they have that secure attachment, they're more likely to explore. They're safer. They feel safer because they have that attachment. And so just thinking about, again, how are we evaluating policies? What sort of litmus test are we putting them through? Are we making sure that we're designing for equity when we're designing? And part of that designing for equity when creating policy is to make sure that we are including the stakeholders that are the most impacted by those policies in the design from the beginning. It's not about designing for or designing to, it's about designing high quality and policies that are impacting communities with community.
I love that. Yes, definitely designing with. Jamie, let's hear from you. And oh, by the way, please put questions, if you have any questions for Jamie, for Danielle, for Suzette, for all of us together, please put them in the Q&A. We are going to have time towards the end of the second hour here.
So one thing, so we did absolutely talk a lot about liberatory design and some other things, but also waters as systems change. And when I think about quality and I think about some of the things that I've heard around assessment, just dropping a few words in the chat that I think about this like space where if you are familiar with it, what this waters of systems change looks like, you might think about this as the mental models. But I think largely around when we are talking about qualitative data, we might be using a standardized assessment, good, bad, or other. But quite honestly, like what I wonder about is how are we even using that information? We ask teachers to collect a lot of information. We have so much information, but rarely do I really see it authentically being used for classroom improvement, program improvement, collective staff development, And or how are we looking at like maybe all of the childcare data that feeds into a specific school system, so we understand like how are we using all this information that we're gleaning from children. And the way I usually see it is like 1 or 2 times a year when we talk to parents, but we're not necessarily like utilizing all of that information for many more things than checking a box for our quality improvement system. And, you know, I'll say a lot of things because I currently am not beholden to one that I maybe couldn't say in another space, but I'm not opposed to child assessment. I've used a lot of tools, but the ones that are the most complicated and get you the best information, you truly have to understand child development and really looking, and you have to be able to like do like pulling for themes, because when you're planning for a group of children, you can pull themes from something like any assessment tool, but are we using that for planning and looking at what experiences happen in a family child care home or in a center-based classroom, or are we just doing it to do it? And so really, quite honestly, when I think about quality, I think not about transactional anything. I think about transformational. What are we doing? And then the other thing that I'd like to just make a about this piece on like policy limitations is that I think that there's a lot of things that have really positive intention and really poor impact. And what I think about this is sometimes around timing, right? Because it's never just one thing. It's never just one policy, but it can be how do we make something happen or grow. I'm going to use 2 just brief examples. Under the Obama administration, we had Michelle Obama in the office. At the time, I was working at a Head Start organization. I was the director of health and nutrition, talking about things like I am moving, I am learning, nutrition, physical activity were much easier to talk about when everybody was talking about them, right? So we were thinking about like, how does the messaging match? Because it's never just one policy. It's how do these things show up in many places? So everybody has shared understanding, shared experience, like, right? We have a desire to do something together. We have resources to do them together. A place where I'm going to go with hopeful, is in the state of Minnesota, effective July 1. We are updating some priority populations for our early learning scholarships. This addresses access and affordability from a parent perspective. Early learning scholarships are typically blended with CCAP funding in our state to help children get in. But our priority populations are children that have experienced domestic violence, have experienced homelessness in the last 2 years, have had child protection touch points, foster care touch points, parents or themselves in mental health treatment, substance abuse treatment needs. So these are examples, children that are on IEPs, IFSPs, like, right? A lot of priorities that we want to get children access to high quality programming so that their families can do the things that they need to do. And that being said, where are the workforce supports to ensure that we are not unintentionally perpetuating that preschool suspension and expulsion issue that we talked about before? Because we haven't necessarily increased all of the well-being compensation packages, the professional development to know, like, if you are experiencing in this classroom, you might be looking at something that has impacted attachment. It might be that you need to do specialized instruction. We haven't really provided the supports for the educators who will then be bringing those children in. And then sometimes, of course, because of data privacy, I'm not trying to go against data privacy, but a family might disclose a situation to create access to a scholarship. That information does not get to the program or the educator. I am not recommending that we have people out their trauma. What I am suggesting here, though, is that when we are looking at quality, is we need to be thinking about places of belonging for our teachers and for our children, right? We need to be thinking about how do we set the foundation so that everybody in here can be successful, knowing that most people's lived experiences, right now I can see a number of people on the screen, 1 in 6 of us have had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. This is the reality of the world that we live in. And that doesn't account for community violence. And it absolutely doesn't account for COVID. I know in the state of Minnesota, referrals for children needing developmental supports, they're up 30%. So I can only imagine that every classroom is just compounded by about everything that could like really create some contentious environments. And how are we resourcing those environments so that they are a place of physical and emotional safety and providing the safeguards for everybody to be successful? And that's where I see like the unintended pieces of policy is that we can have good intentions and saying, we're going to make sure everybody has access, but access to what? Like, where is the next step in that? Like, what are we creating? Because we do not want to unintentionally cause more harm than help. And I think we really have to resource our educators and our parents as the children's first, parents as the first teacher, so we can be in partnership so that children can be well, our educators can be well, our families can be well. When we see all these behaviors in children or adults, they are indicating that people are not okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then we just expect like magic out of the early childhood education and care field. But we're not magicians. We might be community healers, but we need the resources to do that work. And we need the respect. Because I think that is a huge piece here too, is you might fund, it's like say, oh, we know you can do it because you always have. Fund the access for the children, but not necessarily looking at, well, who was doing that work and who may have left the field because they were asked to do so much for so long to be paid in karma that they could no longer set themselves on fire to keep other people warm, and they have left our field. So who's going to do the work next?
Yeah, that is true. I love everything that you guys are saying. One thing that comes to mind, I think one of the issues that I see is how we get wrong about the policy. And I think what's kind of part of our culture in America is that when we fund something, we want proof that it's working, right? So one of the biggest challenges I think around quality is measurement, right? Because we want high quality. We believe all children should have high quality early childhood spaces, right? Parents want their kids to be in a high quality program. Nobody wants to send their kid to a program that's considered low quality or mid quality, right? We want the best. And in a space where we're asking the federal government or the state government to pony up the money, they're going to do it if we can prove, right? High quality becomes then something you have to prove that you're doing, right? But what all the things we've talked about, what's missing is how do you measure things? How do you measure positive relationships? How do you measure someone who fosters joy? How do you measure a sense of belonging that children and teachers have in this space? I mean, we can measure pay equity, right? We can measure that all day because we know we measure it and we know we don't have it, right? We can measure certain things, and those are the things we typically check off. But there's this disconnect between these are the things we know young children and their families need and that we're going to provide, but then we want this kind of proof that we're doing it, right? And that need to prove it leads to this kind of standardization, this checklist, these rubrics, right? Quality measures, right? We put them in our workbook. Some of the quality measures, right, that we looked at as we were getting in here, the states have different QRS systems, right? And so I think there's some issue, and that's not always the policy side. Sometimes it is, right? Sometimes the state says that to get the funding, you have to be high quality, and this is how you say you're high quality, right? And so how do we then negotiate our ability to do high quality and maintain it, but then the desire that we document it or prove it in certain ways, I think is also something that, I'm not sure we can flesh that out here in this conversation, but something that I wanted to know and to see if anyone wants to add anything to that before we move on to some recommendations that you might have for our audience today. So again, my question is about the measurement, and anyone can jump in, right? Well, how do we balance the need to measure and prove quality is happening, and at the same time give people the flexibility to do quality and to do it well? And any experiences that you have, yeah, please.
Okay. I think the challenge comes from the fact that many don't want to honor or truly acknowledge qualitative data. Many folks are that quantitative. We want the numbers, but find a way again to blend do a mixed method, if you will. I mean, this is a challenge of our own, even in our own programs. It's a challenge because I'm always big. I'm biased. I will disclose my bias. I am a qualitative because I believe in this story, the narrative. I want people to understand that when I say I'm serving 564 children, here's the story of those 564 unique and different children. So, I mean, I'm open ears. I'm a lifelong learner. So if you guys have any thoughts and suggestions, please share because it's really a challenge, because again, many folks want the numbers, they want the quantitative. But again, like I said, it's a story. Every number represents a story and a narrative. And my biggest thing is I try to have listening sessions where we bring in funders to hear from our recipients in their own words to understand how this program has impacted them, their children, and their overall community and how it shows up in their lives as a recipient of our services and programs. So that's one process. But again, like I said, I'm a lifelong learner, so I'm here to learn and hear as well. How do you do this when folks really want the numbers?
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm a qualitative person too, and it's more work, right? So on the one hand, in the focus group, when we talked about that, I said, well, look, they were saying, I don't want a checklist. I don't want someone coming in with a checklist telling me I'm quality and they've been in my classroom for 20 minutes. And I said, okay. So on the flip side, are you going to document all of the quality aspects of your program in a reflective practice that requires time? And again, they would love to. She would love to, but does she have the time in her 80-hour work week? So there's this trade-off, right? As we know, qualitative research takes time to hear those stories, right? And so how do we, right? What if our idea was like, okay, we want you to show your high quality. Here's some support, some funding, right? Some, monetary support for you to then document what that looks like, right? And so there's that trade-off that I think needs to be there as well, too.
Taking notes because I like that. That's one of the trade-offs on, again, moving beyond our standard methodology of how we capture and synthesize data. So thank you.
Yeah, I love it. Anything else from Jamie? I know, Suzette, you wanted to say something, and then we'll go into our next question is on recommendations from our panelists, and then we'll hit the Q&A. So again, if you have a question you're dying to ask and we haven't talked about it, please add it to the Q&A. Go ahead, Suzette.
So what I was going to say, Denisha, thank you, is that
Oh, and just hold that mic up a little closer if you can.
Okay.
Yeah.
What I was going to say is again, what you brought up was right, spot on, right? You have this checklist that's collecting data. Someone comes in and they do this 20 minutes snapshot in time, and they tell you that you're quality or you're not quality, and here's your improvement plan, right? So I think, we really do need to think about it differently, and we need to have tools. We need to be innovative in the field, and this is my challenge to all those folks who are interested in creating something new. Right now, the one tool that I've looked at that really does allow for staff to be reflective and use their reflective practice, right? And again, they are co-designing. They are telling us, what they know to be true, to be happening in their program. They live and breathe their program every day. And so we need to believe them when they're telling us, these are some things that we have in place. These are some things that we probably need to work on. And then supporting them with the resources to make those quality improvements, and knowing that it's continuous, right? Quality improvement is not here you go, here's your rating and your quality forever. It doesn't work like that. It's like you have to maintain quality too. And so we really do need to look at tools like what's coming out of the Center for the Quality Workforce out of Berkeley, like the Model Work Standards. And Model Work Standards has been around for a while. It's a tool that does use reflective practice. It's a tool that is done with facilitation and given purpose and time. And so I think more tools like that, where we're engaging with programs to create a snapshot or a story, to tell the story, that also gives us that is a mixed model method, right? It gives us some numbers that we can anchor to for the folks that like the numbers, and it also tells the story. So we're getting a full picture.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think the only thing that I would say is that when I was in Head Start, I was absolutely supported to be part of continuous improvement. I had support from my leadership to get training, right? Like I was a Head Start management fellow. I went to UCLA to understand how to use our organization's data to like make better informed decisions so often we are asking administrators or classroom teachers to use tools, but we're not providing the additional supports for them to really use those tools in their own data to understand what is the impact they are making. And I feel like anytime we ask people to just do something to do something, it's not going to get the results that we intended for that. So we really need to think about how are we resourcing people to use the information that they are gathering from whatever tool, quantitative or qualitative, to know if what they are doing is working. And I think that we want to look at tools to understand not just like child level data, but is what we're doing working well in communities. On my project on 80x3, I have a wonderful advisor named Betty Emerita. She worked on a tool called the Facet tool. I believe it was funded through Kellogg. You can find it at the Wilder Foundation, but it asks really good questions about, and like in the similar method of like ASQSC, where you might look at like, this is what the parent says, and this is what the teacher says. Are they the same? To look at tools of, this is what the parents want, this is what the teachers want, or have a, are they the same? But where are we really collecting the input from adults on both sides to say, do we have shared values around what we want the outcomes for the children in our care to be? Do we have shared spaces where we can talk about this? So I think that there's so much that could be done. There are good tools that exist. I think they're underutilized because, of course, they take time, talent, and treasure to pull them off. And when we never have time. With a workforce crisis, I think it feels like we need an infusion of hope that we're going to continue to have the talent. And absolutely, we need an influx of funds, I think both publicly and privately, to make sure we have the treasure to meet the needs of this generation and those to come.
Yeah, I think that's a super important point, that we don't always agree. We don't discuss and make sure we're on the same page of what we both want, right? Someone put in the chat, ask the parents, are the kids happy? I remember a teacher said that they started their parent-teacher conference by saying, is your child happy? And they got a range of responses. To some parents who are like, I worry about this all day long. To other parents who are like, who cares if they're happy? They're a child, right? But that just starts the conversation, right? Let's talk about the starting point of your child's well-being and happiness, and then go from there before we get into everything else in the classroom. And then the teacher could then understand, based on that parent's response, what mattered to that parent, what they valued, right? And then how they can then talk about the child in that way. So I always thought that was a really, really important thing to do. Well, we're coming down towards the end. We're not done yet. I have one more question for you before we get into the Q&A. I hope you're putting your questions in the Q&A, audience. But before we transition to the Q&A, what are some actionable recommendations that you would offer to our audience as crucial steps in advancing quality in the field of early childhood education and care? Now, our audience comes from all backgrounds. Many of them are childcare providers. I see a lot of them talking, a lot of colleagues that I know. Some of them might be early childhood professors. We might have a contingent of Bank Street Fellows playing along today because of the three of you are here. Retired teachers. I know Jim St. Clair, one of our advisors, is here, and he's a retired kindergarten teacher. Some are parents currently of young children. Some young children, their young children are now adults and their parents themselves, right? So there's not just one person in the audience, but just in general, what can people do who care about this do to kind of support advancing quality, right? What is something that you kind of recommend, whether it's, particular to the people in North Carolina, but that anyone can do, right? Or people in Minnesota or people in Seattle. So why don't we start with you, Danielle, and then we'll go to Suzette, and we'll end with Jamie, and then we'll transition to the Q&A. Sorry, you're still, there you go.
There you go. So I would definitely say to use your power of voice and influence in all spaces that you occupy to really elevate the needs of early child care and education. So again, you're the ambassador, especially the population you just described as our audience. You're the ambassadors. You know what works. So again, elevate that in every opportunity that you have, whatever spaces that you're occupying. I would also suggest that we listen to the people on the ground. Listen to the ones that are normally not invited to the table. The ones that we are not, as the kids would say, you're not checking for them. Check for those who are not coming to the table or being invited to the table. And again, allow them to tell their story. Don't assume, don't make assumptions, truly give space to allow them to elevate their voice and share their experiences, to share their needs, to indicate, here's what's working in my childcare space, but here's how I can see we can make improvements. So again, allowing those unheard voices to be elevated. And then lastly, I would just say to connect with groups on the ground. If you're retired, find an organization, find a school that you can really lend your time and talent to again, to elevate the cause and to continue to advocate for the need for early childcare and education. So that's what I would say.
I love that. Thank you. Suzette, what are some recommendations you have for our audience?
So I would echo everything that Dr. Danielle just said. In addition to that, I would also say that you are your lived experiences matter, and you're able to tell the stories, bring those stories. You can use those stories to advocate. Use your story to advocate. And support the parents to tell their stories, to advocate. One of the wonderful things that we have with our ECAP program here is we have a parent policy council. Those parent policy councils are really strong in our state. They've really helped to, they've gotten a lot of support and learned a lot about advocacy and how policy works and how bills get passed in our state. And they are able to show up, at the state capitol and fight for policy that's equitable and fair, and that's going to support keeping funding in programs like ECAP and in programs like Head Start and programs at the local, state, and federal levels. And so, you're not only are you someone who is working in this field, but you're also a constituent to someone who's an elected official. And in places where you can lend your voice, in places where you can be a facilitator to elevate the voices of others, that's a very important role to have. Some of the biggest and best work is done behind the scenes, supporting other people to champion the issues that we are facing, the really, big issues that we're facing right now in this field.
Yes, I always say the biggest advocacy you can do is just talking to other parents, right? Because they need to hear it from someone else and say, actually, no, I don't support the testing of 4-year-olds. I think that, no, I want my kid to play. No, it's okay to go up the slide. I mean, you can have these conversations with parents, but they're super important, right? To start your advocacy local. Jamie, what else would you like to share with our audience and some recommendations they can take?
Yeah, I would say the first thing is don't do it alone. Like, don't think that you can, right? So like, you have to just know that. So in the space of what has already been shared by my colleagues, really thinking about being active in associations or coalitions, and not just like thinking like, okay, I got myself here. It is absolutely checking around to say like, well, who is here? And if people are not here, what is the barrier, right? So I will just use an example. In Minnesota, we looked at who wasn't utilizing resources, specifically like coaching, early childhood mental health consultation. They were trying to do the work alone. And we asked like really, and we were in a relationship with them where we had long-standing trust and like believability and credibility, so we could get good answers. Mm-hmm. And essentially they were, there's a healthy distrust of systems, but systems are people, right? People who either uphold a policy or dismantle a policy. So there was actually a healthy distrust of people. And so we looked at what conditions needed to be true to change the way in which those people who are being impacted by policy, implementing policy from state agencies and or creating policy, like where were there spaces for them to get together? So it's really about relationship building. And we had to bring in a facilitator. So we brought in a national nonprofit called Embracing Equity, and we created they have a leadership cohort, leadership residency. That's a national thing. We brought it specific to Minnesota to have conversations about what was getting in the way. So we were able to have authentic conversations to know like, oh, Minnesota, we're like passive aggressive. Yes, we are. But now we have the data to say our inability to call out the elephant in the room is getting in our way. Our inability to talk about racism and its impact on child development is getting in our way, and what can we do to move forward, and to have facilitated conversations about what are we going to do now that we clearly know, what are we going to do? So don't do it alone. Sometimes you got to bring in outside help to help facilitate the conversations that are the barriers. And the third thing that I would say is, when I was an executive director, I brought people to me. I just created something. I was like, well, we should be talking about this. I had policy and practice tours, and I would bring people in from higher ed, policymakers, CCAP administrators, anybody who would come. And I just held them essentially like monthly. And we would just go around the building and we would talk about what are the intentions and what does it look like in reality. And we would have just good conversations. They were pretty quick, but they led to long-term different understanding. We weren't putting any children or families like in a weird like zoo observation, but bringing people to me, getting them in my building made such a difference in relationship building. And that was years ago. And I still have those relationships with those people because I asked them to come to me and see what the impact was when we did something great, or when there was good intention, but not great impact. And how was that then living out in practice, and what I could and couldn't do with the resources I had as a director. And we were able to have really frank conversations, because it's very hard to tell somebody that they're wrong in their own house.
Wow, I love that. Yes, bring them in, let them see for themselves, right? I remember reading something. One of my colleagues, Melinda, family child care provider, posted this video, these regulations about like changing diapers that is so far fetched. And my thought was like, you need to bring everyone who wrote that legislation to watch you change diapers in this ridiculous system, so they can be like, okay, that makes absolutely no sense. Because as someone said before, they don't know what it takes. They don't know what it takes to have like a diaper changing system in it, right? And then this rule about having to like change gloves or wash hands each time, it's ridiculous, right? But come in and take a look at what you're asking me to do, see it in practice, see the problems that we're facing, and then say, okay, what is the issue, right? The issue is we want to maintain some type of sanitation. Absolutely, everybody wants to, right? And then how can we do that without this policy that's making it harder, right? And so sometimes, and I always say document that. I would love, I mean, DEY, I hope they would let me host these, but I would love for providers to document, make videos like, this is what the policy is stating for me to do, and this is what it looks like in practice, and this is why it's a problem. And let's put those out there. Let's take over TikTok with, your policy is crazy videos, right? Like, I can't actually do this and support young children videos, right? Like, this is what you're asking me to do, and this doesn't work, and this is why videos, right? And we just send them to people, right? And let them see that. I think we can definitely make some changes there. All right, let's get into the Q&A. We have some great questions, and I'm really excited. So our first question says, what strategies have been or could be promising for motivating policymakers, including center directors, to spend time on the ground? So you just shared a really good example. Jamie, about that, inviting them in. Any other thoughts about how any strategy you've seen that really invite policymakers to come in to see what's happening in the classrooms? I'll share some that we funded through our DEY mini grants, but I'd love to hear anything that might have worked in North Carolina or Seattle, or other things that might have worked in Minnesota as well.
Well, we had a similar approach as what Jamie mentioned, but we called them bus tours, where we would take our different stakeholders to our various partnering childcare facilities for them to just see a day and a snapshot of what it looks like to be in a childcare space. So we did something very similar and called them bus tours.
I love that. And you'd get different elected officials, different people to
Yes.
come on the bus tour. Yeah, I love that. We've also
Those
seen
in business. Mhm.
Yeah, and business leaders too. We've
Mhm.
had people. So we offer DEY mini grants. You'll probably have a link in the chat soon. They're small grants from $250 to $500 that we give to individuals. Right, you don't have to be a nonprofit organization, but it's really about advocacy in the field. And some of the great ones we've seen are lobby days, where they take families and young children to the Hill, to the Capitol, and they show them what play learning looks like. They just have the kids doing what they're supposed to be doing in front, so people can walk by and see it, right? This is what quality looks like. This is what early childhood play looks like, right? Or they bring them into different things. And so I think that's a really good idea as well. Suzette, anything you want to add about ideas for bringing policymakers in?
So I think that one of the things that has been successful for us has been to do an annual during February. We do an annual trip where we do a Have a Heart for Kids Day, and a lot of folks come together for Have a Heart from across the state. You know, locally, we have buses of folks that go out to Have a Heart on the Capitol, and they get to meet with their legislators. Having those relationships, I think, just building those teas, those relationships, inviting people to come to see your program. I know some family child care providers who host an annual tea. And they invite their local legislators in, and they show them again, this is what it looks like to be part of my childcare business. This is what happens in the day in the life of a childcare provider. And just having that relationship, building those relationship, I think with those policymakers is really, really important, because when those policymakers are getting ready to make any implement any changes, or it's about planting seeds, right? So when you plant a seed with someone who has the connection to the power, they're going to come back to you, and they're going to ask you again. They're going to come to you and they're going to ask you, are we doing the right thing? If we're investing in childcare, they're going to remember those experiences that they had with you, and they're going to remember that you built that relationship with them, and they're going to come back to you, and they're going to get to know you, and they're going to ask you questions when they need to make changes. At least that's been our experience here. It's those relationships that you're building with the policymakers that are really going to be helpful for you in the long run. And they love when they see kids. They
Yeah.
love
Yeah.
to have kids come to their offices. They love to get, and the Have a Heart for Kids Day. The big part about that campaign is that we're delivering Valentine's Days to them, Valentine's Day cards that were created by the kids, asking them to remember the children. And when they're making decisions around funding for children, that they have that nice little reminder of their Have a Heart for Kid Valentine right in their office. And the staff, it's always a joyful day on the Hill when they get to see families and children. So,
Yeah, I love that. Definitely sounds good. Anything else you want to add, Jamie? I know you shared a great example of what you did, but anything else that comes to mind?
Yeah, I've got a couple of things. So when I think about Big P policy, I do absolutely. So Greater Twin Cities United Way is a co-sponsor of Advocacy Day for Children. So we bring like hundreds of providers and children to the Capitol to make noise. You no longer can sing past a certain day because me and now Mayor Carter he wasn't a mayor at the time, but we sang head, shoulders, knees, and toes, and some other things so loudly we disrupted session. And so like that's my claim to fame. I was such a disruptor with children, bringing attention to children, that they've changed the day at which you can sing at the Minnesota State Capitol. Oops. Sorry, not sorry. But I think, bringing people to the Big P policy places where you got to keep the pressure on, right? Like we're watching you. The biggest thing I would say of Big P policy is that your legislators work for you. And when we do not empower our educators and our parents, I'm a first generation advocate. I did not know that because my family was not very political, but everything is political. They didn't empower me in the way that, like, this is like, maybe she's born with it. Maybe it's Maybelline. Everything about my advocacy is Maybelline. Like I learned it along the way, and so can you. So like, let's just know that can be true. But bringing people to places that policymakers, Big P, yeah, let's do that to keep the pressure on. Bringing families and educators to session to testify, let's continue to do that. Like that's important. Sharing stories, communication plans, keeping the pressure on. We have some great blogs on our 80x3 website, capturing voices of practitioners and parents about what we're doing and why it's important. So sharing those stories like that have already been mentioned, but making sure that they're getting in front of people. And that might be the press, which we haven't all had communications training. So like, let's continue to think about how we effectively share our story and getting it out there. And then from a little P policy, and somebody had said center directors, we've had to resource. So philanthropy, Greater Twin Cities United Way has funded a cohort of directors to get together to look at cost modeling, share their information, because they were doing excellence in isolation, not coming together and saying like, what are you paying your people? This is how much I'm paying my people. We had to like take away that like dogfight for resources and say, hey, can we come together? And we got people to actually show each other, this is what we're paying. This is like how much. Some people are doing different practices and have increased their wages because they realized that what was happening is their organizational policy didn't match what they were asking of their staff. Some other things that we've done, though, is sharing how somebody wrote in their HR policies about not excluding children or families for behavior unless they had a clear action plan. So they shared that, like sharing resources, bringing people together so that you don't have to create something brand new. It's just like, well, I don't want to do that anymore. How do we not do that? Social capital is important. Relationships matter and sharing resources matter. And then the last piece that we brought some resources in was really around succession planning, because people are retiring or people might be leaving the field. But how do we make sure that we are really intentional about having a plan? So, because we've done so many things in our field that are person dependent, not systems dependent. And when people retire or win the lottery and move away to Hawaii or whatever you do on sabbatical with your lottery winnings, that historical memory walks out the door with those people. So how are we intentionally thinking about succession plans in relationships too? Because policymakers, they change. You might develop a great relationship with somebody for a few years and then they decide not to run again. So it's how do we keep the momentum and give an opportunity for when people need to take a break, that they take a break, they don't quit.
I love that. Thank you for sharing. It also reminds me of how a lot of people work with the people who come in and assess their childcare program, right? How they develop the relationships, and they're always worried that this person's going, someone new is going to come in, they're going to have to start all over, right? But you bring them in, you show them what you do, you build that relationship, and you definitely work with them. And it's the same thing with our elected officials. And remember that they work for us. That's such a good point. So we have a couple questions here about quality indicators. And so it first says, what are some examples of quality indicators that support culturally affirming practices? But then also, what are some examples of tools or quality indicators that really just support warm relationships, interactions, and the same for play, right? So we're thinking about that measuring quality, qualitative ways. What are some things that you might look for around culturally affirming practices and warm relationships, interactions, and support for play? I don't know if you've seen anything in some of the tools that you mentioned as well too that you can share.
I can hop in and just say that I put the facet tool in the link in the chat earlier, but when I really think about tools, I'm just going to say like observation is still really important and representation matters, right? Like you could have any tool that you say does any number of things, but quite honestly, like are the people who are utilizing like who lives in that community, are they utilizing that resource? Do the educators and the administrators, do they match? Because I think that that's just like a high quality indicator right there. And looking at, I worked at in Head Start, I worked at a couple of them, but Pica Head Start, I think just does a great example where 50% of their staff were former parents. And so where are the ways in which we see that this is not just one time, that this is quality over time? And if we can't do it yet, how are we building towards that? I think assessment tools, garbage in, garbage out. You can use a tool to tell you whatever you want it to, but it's hard through observation to fool the eye, and whether or not relationships are there. Like, will the people in that space tell you that they feel seen, heard, and valued? They won't tell you anything if they're not, but they will tell you if they are being treated well.
Yeah, I love that. Also, like observing and talking to the people that matter, right? Do we talk to children about quality, about what they think a good program is? Are we willing to listen to their answers when they give them to us? Because they've got answers, I bet you. Yeah, Danielle, what do you think?
I was having my aha moment. I don't know if you saw my face when I was doing camera, because I was trying to recall the name, but it was designed by Stephanie Carrington Jolly, Dr. Stephanie Carrington Jolly, and it's the ACSES. So it's the tool that looks and measures classroom quality as well as teacher interactions. And it's very much a tool that is designed around culture responsive practices. So that's an excellent tool that some can utilize to measure that classroom quality and teacher interaction.
Thank you.
And thank you for that. And I just wanted to add too that here in Seattle, there are some organizations that are utilizing what we call learning stories.
Mhm.
And so they have,
Yeah.
and it's observational, and it's really just this back and forth journal and relationship with the children, and talking about the children and what children are learning, and telling the story of the child, and relating that to the parent, and then allowing the parent to respond, so that it really is this back and forth conversation that happens over the course of the year, to show how a child is growing and developing. And they've been very successful in taking those learning stories and translating those learning stories into quantitative data, utilizing the Teaching Strategies Gold tool, because that's the tool that they have to use for the Seattle Preschool program. And so it's just this, another way of thinking about doing things, that are that meet the needs of both the educator and the families.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that speaks to a little bit of another question here about the role documentation might play in measuring assessment, and how do we spread the idea to meet the requirement that funded programs are high quality, right? And so what role, they said, what role could documentation play in this? And it sounds like I know a little bit about learning stories. I was tapped for them and I was supposed to give a talk with them, and we haven't gotten around to it. And I hope I get to come back because I'm really intrigued. An organization that I work with called Hatch Partners in Play. We do play stories, right? And so we document what learning looks like through children's play, and we can make connections through social emotional learning standards, other types of areas, right? And so this idea of really documenting what children are doing in multiple levels, right? Children drawing reflections, documenting what they're doing, educators documenting what they're doing, whether it's through photos or videos or observations. But I think the documentation is powerful because I think both Danielle and Jamie and even Suzette spoke to this, the power of telling our stories, right? They're super important, and showing people what high quality looks like in practice, what impedes high quality, what supports it, right? Those come through those stories, and those stories are told through documentation, and it's super important as well too. Jim just mentioned student interviews before parent conferences to get the child's perspective on their experience. I remember one time, and one of the questions was about culturally affirming quality as well. I remember someone one time surveying students anonymously in their school about what was happening around race and culture, right? And using that data, right, to go back to this, the administration might say, we don't need to be focusing on that. Oh, yes, we do, because we have students telling you right now what they're experiencing. And often if we just ask students, right, and these were older kids, they were in elementary school, they were slightly older, but we can ask young children too. We can ask young children questions about their experience and what they're dealing with. We just have to be prepared for their answers as well. And then lastly, we had someone mention about our thoughts about having ongoing reflection through local state-based holistic conversations, and this kind of flexible framework that would allow us to think about different disposition and values. We don't have time to fully get into it, but I will say that I think it's what's needed. I think we have to get out of these one size fits all approach that are very standardized, that are very checklist based, which are very rubric. Even something like the classroom assessment scoring system, which is observation based, which I used. I was a classroom preschool assessor. I've done PD around the class for teachers raising their scores in Washington, D.C. I think it's a valuable tool, but I also think it's limiting in the sense that it doesn't take into the full account. Like I have teachers telling me I can't let children play because I'm being observed by the class tool, and I have to talk to them and I have to do all these things. And I think there's a difference between how a tool is designed and what we think we have to do on it, but how are we using it to improve our practices, right? And so I think we definitely need to think about more holistic approaches to this work. And I hope that you guys all agree with that, as kind of like an ending. We are at 2 minutes out, so I'm going to take an opportunity to kind of wrap us up there. But first, I just want to say a huge thank you to Dr. Danielle Johnson-Offei, to Jamie Bosnick, and to Suzette Espinoza-Cruz for joining us today. And thank you to Bank Street and their amazing Early Childhood Fellow Program. We reached out to them and said, hey, we'd really love some fellows, and you guys came through. And so I'm just really grateful that we had this opportunity to have you on and to share. I know this might be the first time you've been in touch with Defending the Early Years, but I definitely hope it won't be the last. So thank you so much for joining us today. And lastly, come back. I hope you come back for day 3, our final day. This is where we try and do a research in the practice session, because I'm a huge believer that we in the field need to take a lot of the research and really talk about what it looks like in practice. So we're focusing on threats to quality, right, which there are many, but we're really focusing on these laws that are being passed that ban children's books on diversity, that limit teachers' ability to talk about the true history about race and racism in this country. We're also looking at the proliferation of testing and how that's impacting young children and children in general, and new scripted programs that are being mandated, like the science of reading. So we hope that you'll join us for day 3 tomorrow. It's our final day. Same time, same place. You'll get an email with all the resources shared from today. The workbook will be sent to you again, and just preparation for day 3. Well, I will be joined with our co-founder, Nancy Carlson Page, as the co-moderator. Thank you all so much, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow.